Thank you, Deborah and Russ, for asking me, and hello to everyone. I wish I could see all of you. Seems we do more and more of this on Zoom, don't we?
We do.
Let me see if I can share my screen without messing it up. I'm a teacher, and my students long ago taught me that it's more fun if there are pictures to look at than just me. So when Deborah asked me to give this talk, actually, she, I think, asked me to talk about 18th and 19th century women. But even if it had only been 19th century women or only 18th century women, as you'll see, the stories, you can't stop the story in one century or the other. So I'm going to tell you the whole story tonight. This is the myth of the quadroon. This is actually from the Caribbean, this image, but the quadroon, as the introduction said, was imagined to have been a mixed race woman of partial African and European descent, or mixed European and African descent. And her sole purpose in life was to seduce a white man who would act as her sponsor and set her up and take care of her and father children on her. She was doomed never to marry. She was taught the arts of love, presumably by her mother, and she was the epitome of immorality. Now, I don't know too much about this group, but I suspect you have talked before about how Black women are characterized as hypersexual. This is where it all began. So that's the myth, but the reality, as many of you know, or one facet of the reality, is this extraordinary woman, Henriette Delille, who was born in 1813 and died in 1862, who founded a religious order for women of African descent. She's been promoted for canonization and has now been given the title Venerable. So she's well on her way. There's been one miracle. There needs to be a second. So how do we reconcile this contradiction? Here's this myth that's very powerful. You'll hear it if you come to New Orleans and take a tour. And if there are New Orleanians in the audience, you know this. But the reality is actually quite different. And Henriette Delille is the epitome of that historical reality. She represents an extreme of it, but she nonetheless was the culmination, I would argue, of a very deeply rooted tradition that stretched all the way back into the 1720s. So forgive me if I'm telling you things you've already heard. I hope you'll hear some things you haven't heard. One of the things I tell my classes is that we have to begin the history of New Orleans by redefining who the founders were. They were not really the French. There were French people here, nor were they Native Americans. They were primarily African and African descended people, but especially African-born people who were kidnapped in sub-Saharan Africa. 65% of them from Senegambia, that's the area that's today mostly Senegal. And that's who arrived before 1730, nearly 6,000 of them. Now, they were outnumbered by Europeans in terms of the number of people who arrived before 1630. But in terms of who was actually on the scene, that is the people who survived, who lived, it was enslaved Africans, people who had been forced to New Orleans. So when we talk about the founders of New Orleans, both culturally, materially, socially, and I'm going to argue religiously to a large extent, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africans and their children and their descendants. The Ursuline nuns are an order of nuns that started in Italy, but really grew in France. There were 350 Ursuline convents in France and 10,000 Ursuline nuns. And I love this statistic. There were only 5,000 Jesuits. So these women were everywhere, and they were desperate to come to the Americas to convert indigenous women and girls. That was their mission, was the religious education and the education and literacy of women and girls. Officials in the Americas weren't that interested in having them come, so they had to find a way to come. And 12 Ursuline nuns, mostly from Normandy and Brittany, managed to get here by agreeing to take care of the hospital and arrived in the late summer of 1727. And they immediately realized that there would not be a large number of native women and girls who were interested in coming to their convent to learn the catechism and learn about Catholicism, but there were hundreds of African-born women and their children. And so they immediately, really without commenting, shifted their mission to that population. And I put up this passage because it's one of the things that struck me most when I first started to work on the Ursulines. They opened up their school. They didn't have a convent yet. When they did get a convent, this is what it looked like. And they had boarding students. They had a few orphans. They had day students. Among their boarding students were 7 enslaved young women. But what really struck me was that every day, a large number of day students came, among them female Blacks and their children, who came for 2 hours. I want you to picture this, 2 hours in the courtyard of the house the Ursulines were renting for instruction in religion. Now, one of the things I'm frequently asked is, well, why did they go? Were they really interested in Catholicism? I suspect not. But in New Orleans at this time, the Black Code made it illegal for people who lived on different plantations to meet one another socially. If you were a woman and you lived on a plantation on one side of the river, and you had met somehow another woman on the other side of the river, the only way that you could get to see her, and for 2 hours every day, was to go to the Ursuline compound to these 2-hour classes. So I call it a place to gather. It was a place where community was born. It was a female space. And I think this was critically important to what happened eventually, which was that Black, African, and African-descended women and their descendants adopted Catholicism and actually became the core of the Catholic Church in colonial New Orleans. And I think it started because the Ursulines gave them a space to gather. In 1730, so less than 3 years after the Ursulines arrived on the scene, 8 lay women went to visit them. And they asked the Ursulines if they would sponsor a lay woman's soldality, is what you would probably know it as, a confraternity. They wanted to call themselves the Children of Mary. And they pledged to teach their children and the enslaved. 3 of the 80 members of the Children of Mary were named Marie-Thérèse, Marthe, and Magdalene. They were not given surnames. In the records of colonial Louisiana, this means that they were Black women and perhaps enslaved. So we have here in New Orleans in 1730, first of all, I think it's the first really large organization of lay women that was pledged to teach the enslaved in American history. It didn't happen in Massachusetts. It happened in New Orleans. And 3 of the women who signed up for this were themselves either enslaved women or newly freed women of African birth or descent. Now, I have to tell you, I was skeptical when I read that this is what they said they were going to do. And I thought, really? So how do I find out if this is what they did and what the impact of it was? Just knowing about Henriette Delille wasn't enough. And so, fortunately, by the time I started my research in the 1990s, the archives of the Archdiocese of New Orleans were open to researchers. If you applied and got permission, and I did apply and I did get permission, they are extraordinary records. And I should pause here to say that most of my first book was written with the records of the Archdiocese of New Orleans and the records in the private archives of the New Orleans Ursuline nuns. I also used archives in Africa and France and other places, but those 2 places, these Catholic records, were what enabled me to write that book and tell the story that I was able to tell. So I looked at the baptismal records and I discovered that, yeah, these women and their families were frequently, more frequently than anyone else, the sponsors at baptisms of enslaved infants and, really importantly, adults. So they did what they said they were going to do. So that's interesting. So what was the impact? This is one of my favorite documents. There are others that are just as wonderful and interesting, but this was the first one I saw that really blew me away. This is a record of a group baptism of 26 enslaved adults, and some were free, mostly enslaved, on Pentecost Eve in 1762. And I kind of want to treat you like my class. What happened in the early church on Pentecost Eve and on Easter Eve? That was when new Christians came to be baptized. And so with the introduction of slavery, that custom was revived. New Christians were baptized in large groups at large ceremonies on Easter Eve and Pentecost Eve. This ceremony on Pentecost Eve in 1762 revealed that enslaved and free Black people in New Orleans had themselves taken over the job of teaching Catholic religion and bringing people who shared their ancestry into the Catholic Church. And it still sends chills up my spine, I have to tell you, when I imagine now this was not St. Louis Cathedral, it was a humble church at this point. So it would have been crowded. There were nearly 60 people in there, more than 60 because there were some Europeans, so probably close to 100. 58 of them were Black. Many of them were godparents. Most of the godparents were of African descent or African birth. They had taken over this work of evangelization. And we can talk about what their reasons may have been, but what really struck me was, if you look at the records 10 years before, the godparents are all French people. If you look at the records in the 1760s, they are Black people. So they have taken ownership of the church and they are filling the church. And by far make up the majority of the congregation. They're not making up the acknowledged, recognized leadership, but they are the church. Now I'm going to zoom ahead a bit because, and I'll come back to free women of color, but I want to show by the time we get to the 19th century, people would visit New Orleans and they would talk about how strange Catholicism was. And historians have commented on how visitors to the city, like Benjamin Henry Latrobe and another man I'm going to show you, John Watson, what they had to say about Catholicism. But what most historians didn't notice were quotes like this one that I'm showing you, which I think is quite astonishing. So this is from 1819, at which time St. Louis Cathedral, it was a cathedral then, looked like this, not with the steeples that you see on it today. And he says the congregation consisted of at least 4/5 women. So women made up the church, of which number the majority were, as he put it, colored women. I can't really see because my screen's not letting me. But what he comments on not only is their numbers, but their piety, which I find so striking. I've not seen candles offered at the altars, but here there were half a dozen candles stuck on the steps by old colored women. So in 1819, these women would have been some of the women who were being baptized maybe in 1762, or who were children in 1762, but they are part of that first generation that was being brought in to the Catholic Church in New Orleans in the middle of the 18th century. All right, I'm going to toggle a bit now. and talk to you about free women of color. One of the earliest free women of color that we encounter in New Orleans is this woman. This isn't her picture, by the way. We don't know what she looked like, but this is a picture of a woman who was quite like her. Her name was Marie Baud. She was born in Joal, which was a trading post in Senegambia on the coast. Her mother was African and her father was French. They were married in church. She was born legitimately to legitimately, legally married parents, one of whom was African, one of whom was European. And I make a big point of this. By the way, she is a major character in Jessica Johnson's fantastic book, Wicked Flesh, which is about African descended women in New Orleans. But I make a big point about this because the business of procreation across the color line, and indeed marriage across the color line, was nothing new. It was not unique to New Orleans. It was something that we find all over the Atlantic world. We just need to know where to look for it. And we need to know how to read French, frankly. So in 1721, Marie Baud married a man named Jean Pinet. He was a gunsmith employed by the Company of the Indies, which ran both the slave trade in Senegambia and the business in New Orleans. And he worked at Saint Louis, Senegal. In 1724, he was transferred to New Orleans. And 4 years later, Marie Baud followed him to New Orleans. And we find her in the census in New Orleans in the late 1720s and early 1730s. She was accompanied by 2 enslaved servants. She and her servants slept above decks in a stateroom, and below decks, there were 273 captive Africans who were destined for enslavement in Louisiana. Marie Baud arrived in the 1720s. It was very, very difficult. If one didn't arrive free, as Marie Baud had, it was very difficult to find freedom in French colonial Louisiana. The French Code Noir made it difficult, and so did the other laws that were in place. In fact, it basically took an act of Congress. You had to go petition the Superior Council, the governing body. But when Spain took over Louisiana, and Louisiana became a Spanish colony at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, Spanish slave law was introduced. And it was very different from French slave law. First of all, it dated back to the 13th century, before the opening of the Atlantic world, before the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. And it recognized the essential humanity of anyone who found himself or herself in slavery and granted them rights. And among them were several fairly easy ways to gain freedom. They could, and the way that most of them used was to buy themselves. And I'll answer questions about that if you want, but we imagine that enslaved people had no money. That's not true, they did. When they were through with their work, at the end of the day, their time was their own, and they worked very hard outside of their official hours to earn money. And most of them earned their freedom by buying their freedom. One of the myths about free women of color is that they were freed by their white lovers. That's just not true. Most of them bought themselves. And I want to pause here to say, they also bought their children, especially their female children, because they wanted to spare their female children sexual abuse by white owners. So the consequence of this Spanish law was an explosive growth in the free Black population. In 1771, there were fewer than 100. By the time we get to 1810, there were nearly 8,000. And they made up 44% of the free population of Louisiana. It was an enormous force in Louisiana, and they were numerous. Not all of them were prosperous, but some of them were, many of them were. And there was nothing else like it in the slave South. So that wasn't supposed to be the way it was in the slave republic of the United States. Blackness was smooshed together with enslavement. And so was immorality and laziness and all of the stereotypes that we've been grappling with for centuries in this country about African-born and African-descended people. We know that those are untrue. The one that really drew my attention was the one that had to do with women, because I'm essentially a historian of women. So when I came across this quote from Harriet Martineau, who was an English sociologist who visited New Orleans in the 1830s, this is what she says. The quadroon girls of New Orleans are brought up by their mothers to be what they have been, what their mothers have been. So it's an intergenerational pattern. The mistresses of white gentlemen. Every young man early selects one and establishes her in one of those pretty and peculiar houses, whole rows of which may be seen in the ramparts. Harriet Martineau, I am sure, never met a mixed race woman. The end of the quote, which I didn't have room for, says, "As I was assured by the ladies of New Orleans." Well, in 1831, ladies were white. And there were all sorts of reasons for them to disparage free women of color who were not supposed to be earning money, were not supposed to be free, and were certainly not, could never be ladies. And being a lady meant that you were pious, you were married, and certainly you couldn't do that because that contradicted the beliefs about Blackness and slavery. One of the beliefs was that these women were light-skinned, mixed race. They were the product of procreation across the color line. Well, that's not true either. And I know this from baptismal records and from census records. The majority in the 18th century, the majority of free women of African descent were of unmixed African descent. They would have looked probably like the woman on the left in this slide, not like the woman on the right, which is how we imagine they all looked. And they were pious. We know that from the quote that we just saw. We'll see another one. And they were very respectable. They were not lascivious. In fact, they were some of the most respectable and careful in those terms of any of the women in New Orleans, because they had to be. They had to be in order to live down this stereotype, to contradict it. Most of them were married, but some of them were in lifelong partnerships with men of European descent. And I really want to be careful here. These partnerships lasted. These were not white men who set them up in a house somewhere and said goodbye when they decided to marry a white woman. One of the wealthiest men in the colony was a man named Jean-Pierre Cazelar, and he formed a life partnership with a woman named Charlotte Wiltz. He had 5 children with her. He left everything to them. And what he did that I was most interested in, and which is something you can see in this baptismal record, when his children were baptized, the priest would go in the back and record the baptism in the register. And then later, people, the witnesses, might come and look it over and sign it. Well, Cazelar, I can just imagine him. He must have been furious because there are all these scratch outs in the baptismal records of his children. So this one is for one of his daughters, Marie Félicité, and she's not given a last name. And Cazelar goes in and says, I can imagine him saying to the priest, she has my name. Her name is Cazelar. So can you see it's squeezed in here? And then he says, and I'm going to sign the act So here's his signature down here squeezed in. But he also made the priest go in and scratch out the language that said that the father wasn't known. He said, I want my name in there. She's my daughter. And he did this with every one of the baptisms of his 4 daughters. His 5th child was a boy, and the priest got it right. There were no corrections. And I can just imagine the priest saying, oh, I know who this guy is. I'm going to get it right this time. At the end of the 18th century, most New Orleans free women of color lived in monogamous relationships, either married to free men of color or in settled life partnerships with men of European descent. And so I've put here one of the many marriage acts. I studied the whole book and looked at it. And the reason I chose this one is because it contradicts the narrative that free people were trying to lighten their children. This goes against that stereotype. And I'm not saying that didn't develop, but it developed later. The records that I look at before 1830, the sort of color consciousness and snobbery wasn't there. We have women who are identified as mulattresses, or quadroons, marrying men of unmixed African descent. So it's just, that story just doesn't wash. Now here's my second quote, which I really love. This is from John Watson in 1805, and he says, visit the churches when you will, and the chief audience is formed of negresses and mulattresses, and they bring their children, they cry, and they are seen counting their rosaries, praying their rosaries with much attention, and remain long on their knees. So we have these 2 very clear eyewitness accounts of the piety of Black women in New Orleans that were basically ignored for a very long time. So I'm gonna wrap things up by returning to Henriette Delille. So where is she now? And where is the reputation of free women of color in New Orleans? Well, it's come a long way since the time when I wrote my first book, and even since the time when I wrote my second book. There's a general recognition now that the stereotype, the myth, is wrong. The reality that Henriette Delille was not an exception. She was the culmination of a deeply rooted tradition of Black piety, especially Black female piety in New Orleans. And free women of color were the people who filled St. Louis Church, who bought candles, who supported the priests, who taught their children catechism, taught their neighbors catechism, and who sponsored children for baptism, children and adults for baptism. So Henriette Delille, when I started working on nuns in New Orleans, she was known, but not to many people. Now she's known to everybody. And what I'm going to give you 2 examples of how that's so, and it just thrills me every time I see these things. The first is that there is now a Place d'Henriette Delille in the French Quarter. It's right behind St. Louis Cathedral. If you walk along Royal Street behind St. Louis Cathedral, you can't not see this plaque. And I hope you can't walk past it and not ask a question. Who was she? If you walk into St. Louis Cathedral now, you'll see a stained glass window that shows Henriette Delille ministering to Black children. And she's known, I think she's titled in that stained glass window, Servant of Slaves. But not everybody goes to the cathedral and pays attention to the stained glass windows. But those of you in the audience who live in New Orleans know that people pay attention to Mardi Gras. And so in 2018, in the Rex Parade, Henriette Delille had her own float. So I'll end there and answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark. We're going to open it up for questions. So if you have a question, you can use your little signal, or you can raise your hand or whatever. My first question is, just could you explain what the term quadroon means? I've read, but I thought maybe people in this audience may or may not know what that means.
Yeah. I figured that would be a question. So what people believed it meant was it described someone who had 3/4 African descent and 1/4, 3/4 European descent and 1/4 African descent. And like all of these color terms, it's made up. It's crazy. It's part of a belief that people could be reduced in a sort of algebraic equation. And even Thomas Jefferson wrote out equations to describe his own children.
Yes.
The mathematical equation that resulted in a quadroon or a mulatresse. But, the reality is people gave these labels based on what they thought they were seeing. They gave these labels because they wanted to circumscribe people, categorize them, pin them down, and prohibit them from claiming any identity other than that which they assigned to them. Mm-hmm. So I have to use it because people are familiar with it, but I'm adamant about saying it's made up. Okay. It's imaginary. It's imaginary, and we need to understand that.
Great. I'm going to take Donna's question here. But I do want to go back to placage and some of these other terms that are thrown around that you help us. Okay, so Sister Donna, you have a question.
Yes, I am Donna McCullough from Cleveland. I'm an Ursuline sister from Cleveland. And as Ursulines, we claim the sisters who went to New Orleans as the first Ursulines in the United States.
They were.
Yes.
They absolutely
we know
were.
that.
Yeah.
My question has to do with, during your research, did you come across any kind of sense or awareness of the relationship between the free Black women and their servants?
Yes, and it's complicated because it's hard to get at. I'll tell you, first off, doing the research to get at that, they never talk about it. So the only way you can get at how they felt about it is to look at patterns of manumission and property owning. So I'm going to tell you just one story, and I'm still trying to figure it out. There's a block in New Orleans on Rampart Street, by the way. Martineau said that all these kept women were on Rampart Street. There were a lot of free Black property owners on Rampart Street. They'd all been married to Black men. And one of them was an African woman named Marie Ansteve. And I looked into where she came from. I knew she was African. How had she lived? How did she become free? And I found out that she had been owned by a free woman of color, the free woman of color, who lived around the corner from her on Rampart Street. Now, what was going on there in that relationship? I don't know. But it was Marie Ansteve got her freedom. She didn't pay very much for it. And I had a graduate student who looked into the patterns of manumission among free women of color. And she wanted to argue that they were much more likely to manumit than were Europeans who held people in bondage. And I'm not willing to say that, but I do see cases of patronage, because I think that's what was going on between Marie Ansteve and the woman who had owned her, and from whom she bought her freedom. So I can't give you a really good answer to that, because My graduate student decided not to get a PhD and finish the project. But I hope that someday someone will, because those are the kinds of questions that many of us have and would really like to see answered.
Thank you.
Another question that I have before we go to the placage. So you describe Henriette Delille as the culmination of women, the experience and the value system of women of color. There are other scholars who hold her decision to become a religious or to create a religious order up and against a system that sexualized women of color. So, you know, how do we square that, if, you know, in terms of, you know, who Henriette Delille was?
Well, she was different from the stereotype. What I'm arguing is that the stereotype is wrong. So Henriette Delille's great, I can never remember if it's 3 or 4, grandmother was an African-born woman named Nanette. Nanette was held in bondage by a woman named Dubois, Marianne Dubois. Marianne Dubois was one of the 8 women who started the confraternity. So from the very, if you trace Henriette Delille back, it goes all the way back to that confraternity. That's how she was converted to Catholicism. And when Virginia Gould and I traced her Henriette Delille's ancestry, and her female ancestors were all what we call virtuoso godmothers. They were very active in the church. They didn't just go on Sundays. They were very active in the church. And so, I don't know if culmination is the right word, but she certainly doesn't break the pattern. She's an extension of the pattern. Now, what makes her story complicated is that Henriette Delille and her female ancestors did bear children out of wedlock. And we only recently discovered that about Henriette. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, because I look at these relationships, I see so many of them, but both of her children died as infants. And I think almost more than anything else, that's why she decided to lead a life of religion. We'll never know, we can't interview her. But no, she poses a contradiction to the stereotype, but she didn't become a religious. I just don't believe that in order to contest it. I think she was led to it from a very deeply rooted family tradition and to the strength of Black Catholicism in New Orleans. It was very, very strong.
Excellent. That's wonderful. And we had a question from Sabrina who said, is it true that Henriette Delille had a child before she became a religious? And yes. It sounds like you're saying yes, that's a kind of a newer. Okay. Does the historical record show, this is also from Sabrina, does the historical record show that Black women in the 18th and 19th century New Orleans had multiple long-term relationship marriages? That was true of my ancestors. And so Sabrina,
some women,
yeah,
some women. I don't find that to be, in the 18th century in particular, I don't find that to be typical. I find long-term relationships. Now, there were some that were serial. So I'm never going to say never, but what bothers me is that people assume that that's the norm.
Right.
And it wasn't necessarily the norm. I also want to say, and I don't know about your ancestors. This was Sabrina.
Yes.
But this is a complicated thing, so bear with me. In 1809, 10,000 Haitian refugees arrived in New Orleans, and 3,000 of them were women and children. And the women, what happens to women who are refugees? Do I even need to tell you what happens to them? They weren't going to find marriage partners in New Orleans. I think some of them fell into sex work and into serial relationships. And I think that was a moment in the history of New Orleans and of this particular population. And it's a really sad, it's a really troubling thing for me to see, because they were not marrying New Orleans free men of color. They were not marrying at nearly the rate that New Orleans born free women of color were. And the other thing that I found that just drove me crazy was that they often bore children to, yes, to white men, but not to French speaking or Spanish speaking white men, to white men who came to New Orleans from Philadelphia, from Boston, from Virginia.
Very good. And
They went away. I mean, they did abandon those families, including Henry Clay's brother was one of them.
Who did you say?
Henry Clay's brother was one of them.
Wow. Great. And here's another question that you can answer. So was Henriette part of the quadroon ball scenario? So you
No,
about that.
you got to forget about the quadroon balls. So let me tell you,
Good,
there were two kinds of balls that, first of all, before 1805, all of the balls were mixed. They just were. And so there was nothing about them that was about a meat market, which is how they are portrayed in fiction and in film. Sometimes I show a clip of the Feast of All Saints with Jennifer Beals, which has a quadroon ball. In 1805, a Haitian refugee with two mixed race daughters that I think he was worried about rented the ballroom, the public ballroom, and promoted a ball for white men and women of color, and no men of color would be admitted. His name was Auguste Tessier. And I think, again, this is something that was directly related to the Haitian Revolution and the refugee crisis in New Orleans. The balls that were set up that way became staged events. By the time we get to the late 18 teens, they are tourist attractions. And tourists come to New Orleans, and it's one of the things that they're taken to see. And so you can take from that what you want. At the same time, there were balls that were called the cordon bleu. Oh, and all you had to do was pay a bit of money, and you could go to these commercialized balls that were set up really as curiosities. And I can't speak to well, let me just finish. So on the other hand, there were balls that were organized by free people of color, most of them married. And you couldn't buy your way into them. You had to be invited. And these were called the bal de cordon bleu, the blue ribbon balls. And the purpose of these balls, I'm pretty convinced, although it's not explicitly stated, was for the free families of color to find free men of color for their daughters to marry, because they were into respectability. And there was one of the most interesting pieces of evidence that argues in favor of this interpretation is there were two young women who were Haitian refugees, and their father instructed the man who was acting as their guardian in New Orleans. Their father said, "Don't let them go to those other balls. I want them to go to the cordon bleu balls." And the guardian writes back and says, "Well, they really want to go to the other ones because everybody dresses up more for those." And it broke my heart, really. But the father and the guardian were adamant, "No, you have to go to these because the whole point is we need to find you a good husband." So that's, and they never called them quadroon balls. The people themselves in New Orleans, the people of African descent, that was not what they called them. That's what white people called them.
Thank you. That's very good. Edward, do you have a question? Edward, you'll have to unmute.
As time went on, after Henriette Delille died, the the congregation eventually split, and it split really over letting, what is it, Chloe Preval, I think, into the order as the first full Black person. And so, as I say, they divided, and it was only much later, after at least 10 years, that they came back. So what I'm wondering is, from what you said, and from that, and I know the Holy Family Sisters have had in their own congregation, have had a problem concerning light and dark and so forth. How did we get from what you were talking about to that kind of mentality that they don't want somebody like Chloe Preval in? It wasn't until, I believe, Mother Austin Jones, who became the first really full non-French African-American person to be the Mother Superior.
Well, I'm going to bore you by being historically contextual here, because that comes, we have to remember that things weren't standing still. So we're looking at antebellum America. And by the 1840s, which is when the Sisters of the Holy Family were recognized as a religious congregation, free people of color were being thrown out of Louisiana. Racism was becoming more and more harsh. More and more of the rights of free African descended people were being infringed and taken away. So racism is growing. And I think the Sisters of the Holy Family are being impacted by that. They're not operating in a vacuum. And so everything is getting much more color conscious. And after the Civil War, it gets even worse. It really does break my heart, because when I talk to descendants in New Orleans about this and say, this is what I see, and I give examples, and it says, and I say, it just breaks my heart. When did this happen, and why did it happen? And I'm blaming it on the white people, just making it more and more difficult to be Black, and giving more and more weight and value to color.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the question, Ed. Regina, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I was kind of curious about that, just because I was thinking of the Louisiana Purchase, and I asked in the chat what impact the takeover, if you will, by Americans had, and I wonder if it was bringing a more Southern style of racism and racial relations, and in fact, American style at that period. And I was also curious, I never knew about the importation of the Haitians. And I wonder if the Americans were more open to the Haitian people coming after they were controlling the port of New Orleans.
Oh, that's a really good question, a complicated one. Actually, the Americans didn't want the Haitians. They were terrified of them. They were terrified of them. They were afraid they would bring a slave rebellion to Louisiana. And you know what? They were sort of right, because in 2 years after the refugee influx of 1809, the largest slave rebellion on American soil took place. It's called the German Coast Uprising. Most people haven't heard of it. The biggest ever, maybe as many as 500 insurgents. Sorry?
Where was it? The German Coast?
It was just north of New Orleans, and it's known as the German Coast Uprising, or sometimes it's known as the DeLande Uprising, after the man who led it. But it started just north, just upriver from New Orleans. And it was huge. But to go back to this, the United States did not want them coming here. They were really worried about it. And the reason they allowed them in was because of sugar and the desire to make a lot of money. The New Orleans sugar planters, the Louisiana sugar planters begged Congress to make a special exception to the outlawing of the international slave trade, so that the people who were brought to Louisiana and labeled as enslaved people could be allowed in, because technically they couldn't be. And they were actually held up at the mouth of the Mississippi until Congress passed this Exception Act.
Yeah.
And so they wanted them here. They didn't want them here, but then they did. And the people who wanted them were not the American administrators. It was the sugar planters, who were French and Anglophone. There were a lot of Anglophones here by that time. So I don't know if that answers all of your question, but it was a complicated thing. Governor Claiborne, the territorial governor, was absolutely terrified when the refugees started showing up.
Thank you.
Thanks, Regina. I don't know, you have BSSBA as your name, so I don't know what your name is, but you have your hand up. Go ahead.
She's got something in the comments chat.
Is that
And I'm
me?
terrible at finding that.
Is that me, Gaynell? What, Gaynell?
Hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, and had the honor of going to St. Mary's Academy and with the Sisters of the Holy Family. And I appreciate your message. It gave me the history of the rosary. I still say my rosaries every day. And just to connect with those women in a historical way, knowing that's what they did, was extremely important. The other thing that I think just to comment on was the fact that in terms of the skin color, the lighter you were and closer to white, the more privileges you had. Whether you were able to get in the store, I'm just using that as an example because people don't understand how deep the racism is in terms of how we were treated. I went to school right in the French Quarter, 717 Orleans Street. So if you go to Bourbon Orleans, that was my old school. And we went to mass every day. So though the history that you presented, it just warms my heart because I lived it. And that answer that's been passed on. So I call her Harriet. She's still alive and her mission is still alive through the nuns that are still there. And my chemistry teacher still remembers all of my experiments. So the nuns are still around. They still own the property. And I think we miss all of those different pieces that there are those of us who are educated by Harriet's followers in the whole institution. And we carry on that mission. So she's alive and well, as I should say.
I'm so glad. I know a lot of the sisters.
I bet you do.
And gosh, they're extraordinary. And
Yes.
what an incredible, the more I learned about what was happening way back in the 1700s
Right.
and the energy
Yes.
of these women,
Yes.
unbelievable.
I know. I will say this, I won't bore you, but when we used to sell the world's finest chocolate, Sister Demetria would call me down to the office. Now, you wouldn't let a 6 or 7-year-old go in the French Quarter selling candy today, but she would have me go and sell the candy in the French Quarters, and I'd come back with a wad full of money and all the candy. And so those were beautiful experiences in terms of the people, the energy in the French Quarters, the interaction with people. It's like no other experience. And I was a school principal, Catholic school principal too. So yeah, so I just think that those are the things that have occurred in my life that really has passed on as a result of my schooling at St. Mary's. So I wanted to share that because you don't have many people here on the call that do. So thank you very much for your history. I
Well,
appreciate
thank
it.
you. And you have such an incredible heritage.
Yes,
Proud of.
yes, thank you.
Well, that is a wonderful question, story, comment to end things on, because we are now at 1:08. So thank you all. Thank you, Professor Clark. Thanks for all your questions. There's just so much to know. And certainly this 1 hour will not fill that need up. One question that if you could answer for us, Professor Clark, if there was one book for us to read, is it the Quadroon book? What would be the book that you would recommend for us to understand this broad sweep of history, or maybe not, but what could give us the best sort of understanding?
It's hard. I mean,
Yeah.
the book that means the most to me is the Strange History of the American Quadroon. And I feel the need to share with you that it's not the book I planned to write. It was my second book. I was going to write a very different book. But after Hurricane Katrina, I was so angry at the way New Orleans was being mischaracterized. That and the lies that had been told about women of African descent in this city for more than a century. It just drove me crazy because I was reading the records and I knew how pious they were. So that's why I decided to write that book. And it's the best decision I ever made. It was very hard, but I'm really glad I did it.
Thank you so much. Well, we'll put that book in our notes when we send out and where you can purchase it so that everyone can have a chance. It's on my shelf and I've been plowing through it. So thank you again so much. And I'm going to turn this over to Russ, who is going to take us out of here.